He moment the ballroom fell into silence. I didn't quite understand why. Conversations halted mid-laughter. Glasses froze halfway to lips, and the pianist, who had been playing some forgettable jazz number, hit a dissonant note and stumbled. I turned my head, confused, still holding my champagne flute in the air, and realized every single person in the room was staring at me. All I had said quietly, with nothing but a smile, was, "Congratulations on the big news coming your way." That was it. Just that one line. Simple and kind. Or at least I thought so. Camilla Sterling didn't see it that way. She stood across the room, radiant in gold silk and the glow of her own ambition. But when I said those words, something in her face shifted. Her smile faltered not fully, just slightly, like a flickering chandelier right before the power cuts. Her lips, usually curled upward with curated grace, tightened at the corners. And for a moment, she looked at me not as a colleague, not even as a threat, but as someone who had just triggered a tripwire she'd planted years ago and almost forgotten. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just stared, calculating in a way that felt surgical, like a surgeon deciding whether to cut something out before it spreads. I stood frozen in place, unsure whether to lower my glass or pretend like nothing had happened. The people around us, executives, spouses, investors, began shifting uncomfortably, their smiles dissolving like sugar in water. I had spent 11 years at that company. 11 years building the very audit system that kept their empire afloat. The one that caught problems before they turned into lawsuits. The one no one talked about unless something went wrong. That system was my design, my late nights, my lost weekends. I never asked for recognition. I didn't need a plaque or a bonus. I just wanted the truth to hold. Camila? She wanted something shinier. She didn't understand code or compliance. She understood control, optics, legacy. She wasn't promoted. She was positioned. Dropped into a senior role she didn't earn, placed on a pedestal by her uncle, the CFO, and paraded around like a promise of a modern, media-savvy future. Her success was measured in Instagram likes and Vogue profiles, not internal controls or ethics dashboards. And that night, under a ceiling of gold chandeliers and soft jazz, she was basking in what was clearly meant to be her coronation. Except I had said something she didn't script, and the mood shifted. She tilted her head slowly, almost imperceptibly, and her voice came soft but cold. "Mia," she said, with a tone like the edge of a blade wrapped in satin. I smiled politely, confused. Then I saw it, her phone, held in one perfectly manicured hand, lighting up with a text. Just one glance, but it was enough. Add her to the list. Handle it tonight. That was when my pulse jumped. I didn't know what list she meant. I didn't know what I had stepped into, but I knew, in that instant, the game had changed, and I wasn't holding the cards. They came for me minutes later. One of the junior managers, nervous, avoiding eye contact, approached with a calm voice that didn't match the urgency in his eyes. "Miss Malkova, could we speak with you for a moment?" He didn't wait for my answer. He just gently touched my elbow, guiding me away from the velvet and champagne like I was part of the decor being quietly replaced. I didn't resist. I walked. My heels echoed across the marble in a rhythm that sounded too final, too deliberate. They led me into a glass-walled conference room on the far end of the building. The city sparkled behind Camilla, who was already seated at the head of the table, like she'd been waiting there all night. She didn't rise. She didn't smile. Two interns, at least that's what they looked like, flanked her, barely old enough to drink, certainly too green to understand what was about to happen. Camilla didn't look up. "Close the door," she said, still scrolling on her phone. I stood still. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally raised her eyes, and they were sharp, clear, and utterly devoid of empathy. "What's going on?" she repeated, slower this time. "Is that you just violated company protocol?" I blinked. "It was a toast," I said, disoriented. "I was congratulating you." She gave a soft, almost pitying laugh. "You're not paid to predict news, Mia. You're paid to manage spreadsheets, systems, not narratives. Stay in your lane." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything else, she picked up a pen and signed the document sitting in front of her. "Effective immediately," she said, then glanced at the interns. "Broadcast it to the internal channel. Let the team see what happens when someone forgets who's in charge." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Broadcast? Not inform, not discuss, not clarify. Broadcast, like a press release, like a spectacle. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I looked down. Subject: termination notice. Effective now. That was it. No meeting, no explanation. Just a subject line. Just an end. 11 years of work, loyalty, contribution, gone in a silent ping. I looked at Camila one last time. She was already back on her phone, her posture relaxed, as if she hadn't just gutted my entire career in front of 2 interns and a city skyline. She expected me to cry, to beg, to lose control. But I gave her nothing. I held my breath, lifted my chin, and nodded once. If she wanted to strip me of everything, I would at least leave with my silence, and I would leave standing tall. The glass doors slid shut behind me, and this time, they didn't sound like doors anymore. They sounded like vaults, locking away a chapter of my life that would never open again. The marble lobby felt different on the way out. Just hours before, it had been a place I glided through on caffeine highs and quiet pride, a space that had held the rhythm of routine and the buzz of controlled ambition. But now, each step echoed with something colder. My heels tapped against the polished floor like a metronome, counting down the seconds between who I had been and what they had just made me. No one spoke as I passed. Not the receptionist who used to smile and slip me coffee on rainy mornings. Not the analysts who once asked me questions they wouldn't dare email to Camila. Not even the security guard who knew I never logged out late unless something was broken. They all looked at me, but no one looked me in the eye. And in that silence, I heard everything they weren't saying. You're done. You've been erased. And maybe we should pretend we never saw you at all. I reached the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The glass panels reflected a version of me I didn't recognize. My jaw was tight, my eyes were tired, my posture too controlled. The doors opened, and I stepped in, alone, as the floors began to drop beneath me. It felt like punishment. Each level I passed was a memory. The 5th floor, where I used to pull all-nighters during audit season. The 8th, where I pitched a process overhaul that saved the firm $6 million in losses. The 12th, where I once got locked in a data room with the CTO during a blackout and still came out with a clean report. Now, all of it meant nothing because of one sentence spoken at the wrong time to the wrong woman. Outside, the cold night air hit me with a kind of clarity I didn't expect. I stood there for a moment, holding my coat closed, watching the tower I had served for over a decade glow against the city skyline. It didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt like a monument to everything I had just lost. 11 years erased in 11 minutes. No warning. No decency. Just a cold calculation by a woman who wore ambition like perfume and wielded authority like a camera flash. I had given them everything. Sleepless nights hunched over logs no one else could decipher. Weekends spent tracing discrepancies other departments missed. Holidays cut short because no one else could crack a code buried 6 layers deep in the audit trail. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. But I was essential, and they knew it, until it was no longer convenient for them to remember. Then, just as I turned toward the curb to call a cab, my phone buzzed again. At first, I thought it was HR. Maybe one more insult disguised as a final severance notice. But when I glanced down, my breath caught in my chest. Alert. Tier 3. Surveillance mode activated. Secure report dispatch. In progress. I froze. That wasn't a corporate system message. That was mine. That was my code, the one they didn't even know existed. Years ago, when I built the audit control system that became Sterling Financial's crown jewel, I added a safeguard, not out of paranoia, but out of experience. I knew what happened to people like me, the ones who built in silence, who never asked for credit, who became too competent to be seen as harmless. So I hid a silent trigger, deep in the system's foundation. If my credentials were revoked without protocol, no due process, no oversight, the system would flip into defense mode, designed to protect not the company, but the truth, and also, quietly, to protect me. Now it was happening. The termination flag had fired the sequence, and the system had already started rerouting encrypted reports, moving through secure tunnels I had built years earlier and kept hidden. Financial discrepancies, unauthorized edits, metadata trails, all of it was being extracted and sent directly to the Federal Audit Oversight Commission. Not a threat, not revenge, just procedure, quietly followed. I didn't smile. Not then. I just stood still, phone pressed to my palm, feeling the vibration of each transmission like a pulse, reminding me I wasn't gone yet. The world thought it had watched me walk out defeated, but the storm wasn't behind those glass walls anymore. The storm had just stepped outside. The cab ride home was quiet, but not peaceful. The city lights passed in golden streaks across the windows, and I sat there with my phone still resting in my hand, not as a device anymore, but as a lifeline. While the world outside blurred with traffic and crosswalks and neon storefronts, my mind was focused like a blade. I unlocked a private dashboard one. No one at the firm even knew existed, and watched as the audit control system ran through every protocol I had embedded years ago. The reports were moving swiftly now, tunneling past the company's firewalls, encoded with every fingerprint that mattered. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a stunt. It was insurance, and it had just matured right on time. They believed they owned everything I created. But they were wrong, because I didn't just build them a tool. I built myself a shield. Inside the system's codebase, buried beneath layers of operations no one ever questioned, was a tiered failsafe designed to activate only if I was removed improperly. No investigation, no chain of command, no respect for process. That was the trigger, and Camila had pulled it with a smirk and a pen stroke. She didn't just fire me. She flipped the switch I had quietly placed for moments exactly like this. The data split like tributaries, one stream for internal logs, another for forensic trails, a third encrypted route for full disclosure to the Federal Audit Oversight Commission. Every late-night edit, every number massaged into optimism, every discrepancy she buried was surfacing, not in anger, not even for revenge, but because the truth had nowhere left to hide. And the report wasn't just numbers or quarterly summaries. It was a living map of manipulation, with timestamps, user credentials, and silent red flags tied directly to her digital signature. I watched the progress bar crawl from 83% to 91, then to 100. And for the first time that day, I felt something close to calm. She had believed that humiliation would be my ending, that she could erase me with style and optics, that my silence meant surrender. What she didn't know, and what she had never cared to understand, was that while she was climbing the ladder in heels and headlines, I was embedding a firewall no PR team could rewrite. I pictured her in that ballroom again, sipping champagne with people who only loved her when the lights were warm and the press was watching. She was probably toasting herself, believing the narrative had been shaped, the threat neutralized. What she couldn't see yet was that every late-night override she'd approved to hide a $320 million shortfall was no longer hidden. Her name wasn't buried in code anymore. It was rising through it, line by line, and surfacing like oil in water. As the cab slowed to a red light, I finally exhaled. Not in triumph, not in satisfaction, but in precision. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure the foundation I built couldn't be twisted into a lie. They thought I was predictable. They thought I would go quietly. But they had only ever seen half the blueprint. The other half was mine, and it was already in motion. Far above the city, Camila was sitting in a glass-walled war room, wrapped in confidence that she hadn't earned, surrounded by junior staff who mistook her stillness for strength. She was probably reviewing final slides, making final calls, rehearsing for tomorrow's investor briefing, like she was preparing for a magazine cover shoot instead of a financial reckoning. The script was perfect, the graphics stunning, the numbers curated. What she didn't know yet was that the very system she had been praising for months was no longer playing by her rules. Somewhere in the building, a quiet red error message blinked on her screen. Report: invalid. Verification failed. And just like that, her carefully manufactured illusion began to crack. "What the hell is this?" she snapped, turning toward the IT lead with a voice too sharp for the hour. The man, clearly nervous, typed faster, his tie visibly tightening around his neck with every keystroke. "It looks like the system is requesting level 3 verification," he stammered, not meeting her eyes. Camila leaned in, trying to steady herself, trying to fix it before the wrong people noticed. "Then give it what it wants," she said, her words low and venomous. But the pause that followed was longer than she expected. The IT lead finally looked up and said something that shattered the rhythm of her breath. It needs a digital signature. Mia Malkova's. The silence that followed felt heavy, even through the digital lens. Camila's perfectly powdered expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. My name had found its way back into the room she tried to erase me from, not as a whisper, not as a rumor, but as the one key her entire scheme could no longer function without. She muttered something cold, something about finding a workaround, but the technician only shook his head. "This isn't standard encryption," he said quietly. "It's proprietary and layered." Camila didn't have time for defeat. She made a call to a man named Rafe Mercer, a digital mercenary whispered about in boardrooms when companies needed things to disappear. She wired him payment before he even requested a number. Minutes later, his screen flickered to life in her penthouse office, casting his silhouette in neon code. "Your cage is impressive," he said, fingers dancing across a keyboard, "but not unbreakable." She smiled then, just slightly, watching firewalls crumble as if this were a spy film and she was the heroine reclaiming control. But Rafe paused, his eyes narrowing. "Wait," he said, his voice losing its swagger. "There's a second gate. Biometric, tied to a verified national ID. And guess who it belongs to?" Her hand, still holding a glass of wine, tensed visibly. "Mia," he said. Then he leaned back slowly, his smirk now gone. "Without her token and her live authentication, the system won't just stay locked. It will brick itself against any attempt to override permanently." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was damning. Camila didn't scream. She didn't panic out loud. But she reached for her laptop and in one swift, bitter movement, hurled it across the room. It shattered against imported marble, fragments of glass catching the moonlight like glittering proof of her unraveling. Her assistant appeared at the doorway, startled. "Bring me a fresh machine," Camila said calmly, smoothing her hair with fingers that still trembled slightly. Her voice was silk, but the steel beneath it had bent. "Tell my uncle I'll have everything ready by morning," she added, not because it was true, but because she needed it to be. She whispered to herself then, just once, a lie she had told so many times it had become a mantra. Everything can still be controlled. At 2:15 the morning, my phone buzzed again. Just one soft vibration on the nightstand, enough to pull me from that half-sleep where exhaustion and adrenaline finally meet. I blinked through the darkness, reached for the screen, and what I saw made me sit up without hesitation. Unauthorized modification detected. Video capture active. Log secured. For a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming, if fatigue had finally started to twist reality, but the data was crisp, clean, undeniable. My system wasn't just running, it was recording. Camila was in, not just logged into the network, not just poking around the edge of the code, but burrowing into the core itself like a desperate animal, scraping at numbers, rewriting lines, trying to bend the structure around her lies. The surveillance feed caught everything, down to the reflection of cold determination in her eyes, down to the trembling in her wrist as she pushed override after override, as if forcing the truth to break would somehow make the deception disappear. But she wasn't fast enough, and more importantly, she wasn't invisible. The logs beside the footage were more than data. They were a confession in black and white. 2:14 a.m. Override initiated under credentials registered to C. Sterling. 2:16. Data masking applied to the Q3 summary. 2:17. Hidden ledger accessed. What she uncovered there was darker than any quarterly shortfall. She found the evidence I had stored away, not to destroy her, but to preserve what was real. The negative balance she tried to bury $320 million in losses was now staring back at her, no longer buried beneath colorful charts or polished optimism. I sat at the edge of my bed, lit only by the glow of my screen as the feed continued. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched as the woman who had orchestrated my very public removal tried, in the dead of night, to dismantle the integrity I had spent over a decade protecting. 11 years of work had not disappeared. It had taken root in the one thing she never understood: structure that didn't bend, code that remembered, truth that didn't flinch. Then, a second notification slid into view. Federal Audit Oversight Commission. Evidence received. Emergency inquiry initiated. I read it twice, the weight of those words settling into my chest like cold steel. My failsafe hadn't just recorded it, had delivered. Every override, every masked cell, every signature tied to her name was now in the hands of people who couldn't be bought, who didn't care about photo ops or family trees. I leaned back against the headboard, exhaled slow and deep. This wasn't victory. Not yet. It was the start of accountability. And as the sun began to hint at the edge of the sky, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted until now. Camila didn't just underestimate me. She misunderstood the entire architecture of what I built. Because this wasn't just about code or contracts. It was about memory, about creating something that couldn't be rewritten, just because someone higher up changed their mind. And now, for the first time since the night she humiliated me, she was facing something she couldn't outmaneuver. The truth was no longer a quiet artifact buried in the system. It had become a witness. By the time morning arrived, the illusion was already cracking, not just behind closed doors, but across every screen and every office corridor that once echoed Camila's name like a rising anthem. The investor meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m., a routine gathering on paper, but in reality, it had been crafted as her moment of triumph, a carefully choreographed performance, where confidence would drip from every chart and fabricated gain. But something was off the second she walked in. The mahogany table, always polished and pristine, was surrounded by 30 stakeholders whose smiles were tight and questions sharper than usual. And then the screen lit up, not with her glossy slides, but with a warning, bold and blinking in red. Report validation failed. Export denied. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the questions came, layered and unrelenting. What does that mean? Is this a system glitch? Are you telling us these numbers aren't certified? Camila stood, visibly pale but composed on the surface, and gave a response that barely held itself together. Just a temporary delay, she said, trying to sound bored, dismissive, in control. But before the room could fully absorb her answer, another voice cut through the air, cold, curious, almost amused. Then why are shares dropping in real time? All eyes turned to the live ticker projected on the wall. The green began to slip into red, not slowly, but with the kind of speed that makes people hold their breath. 1 point, then 3, then nearly 6, an avalanche of value rolling downhill without brakes. Someone whispered a curse. The CFO, Camila's uncle, leaned forward in his seat, his voice low and shaking with something dangerously close to rage. Camila, what is happening? She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat worked, her eyes scanned for an exit, a line, a script. Anything but the silence hit her first, and then the screen changed again. The slides she had prepared vanished. In their place appeared a new header, clean, brutal, and immune to spin. Integrity alert. Data violations detected. Evidence submitted to Federal Audit Oversight Commission. The words might as well have been a gunshot. Phones lit up around the table, news headlines rolling in faster than any PR team could intercept. Sterling Financial under federal scrutiny. $320. Million loss concealed. Audit lockdown. Traced to internal conflict. Panic wasn't just visible now, it was contagious. Camila stood frozen, her knuckles white against the edge of the table, eyes locked on the screen as if sheer willpower could force the letters to vanish. But they didn't. And they wouldn't. The system wasn't hers to override anymore. Every edit she made, every unauthorized change, every deception she wrapped in polish and projection was now out of her hands. One board member leaned forward and asked the question everyone else was too stunned to voice. Is this real? The CFO didn't answer. His jaw was tight, his eyes hollow, and for the first time since my removal, he didn't defend her. Camila had built her rise on the illusion of control, but illusions only work when no one checks the mirror. And this morning, the mirror was unflinching. The investors were no longer listening. They were watching, reading, dialing, and somewhere beneath her expensive blouse and perfect poise, she must have known. The truth wasn't buried. It had been excavated, and now it was parading itself across every floor of the company she once thought she ruled. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, and in the reflection on its surface, she didn't see a leader. She saw a liability. The call came just as I stepped out onto the rooftop of my apartment building, the city stretching around me in all directions, flickering like a theater waiting for its final act. My phone buzzed only once. No name. Just a number I hadn't seen in months, but recognized instantly, the kind of number you don't forget when it once belonged to the inner circle of a boardroom that used to feel like home. I answered without speaking, and the voice on the other end didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mia," he said, clipped and breathless. "We need to talk. Now." They didn't ask where I was, because they already knew. 27 minutes later, I stepped into the very boardroom where they once dismissed me, like I was just another spreadsheet error to be corrected. But this time, the energy was different. The panic hadn't left the air. It had only become quieter, more concentrated. The polished wood of the table now held the scent of desperation, masked weakly by cologne and burnt coffee. Camila was already there, sitting still, too still, pale and small in the same chair she had occupied when she signed my termination. Her uncle, the CFO, flanked her again, though this time he wasn't hiding contempt behind confidence, he was hiding fear behind silence. I didn't sit. I didn't smile. I stood at the head of the table and let the weight of my presence fill the room. I looked at no one in particular as I spoke, my voice calm and deliberate. "I can bring the system back online," I said plainly, "but it won't be for free." A murmur rippled through the board, half disbelief, half anticipation. They hadn't expected compliance. They had expected desperation. But what stood before them wasn't the woman they'd pushed out. It was the architect who had never needed permission to build anything lasting. "I will restore access," I continued, "under two conditions." My eyes scanned the faces in front of me, some turning away, others holding their breath. "First, Camila resigns. Effective immediately, publicly." She flinched, just barely, but enough. Her uncle opened his mouth to speak, but I raised a hand and cut him off with a simple glance. "Second," I said, "the service contract for the audit control system transfers fully to my firm. Exclusive rights, maintenance, licensing, deployment, all of it." The room didn't explode. It didn't need to. The silence said more than shouting ever could. One of the board members, a man who once told me my talent was wasted in back-end engineering, dropped his pen onto the table, the click loud in the stillness. The CFO, after a long pause, finally found his voice, low and clenched. "You're extorting us." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, "not with malice, but with finality. I'm offering you a lifeline." I didn't need to explain the rest. The system was locked, yes, but worse than that, it was under scrutiny, and not by me. The Federal Audit Oversight Commission had already begun pulling apart the logs, following the footprints left by every user ID, every after-hours access, every manual override. I didn't need to say who had edited the reports. The metadata would do that for me. Across the table, Camila sat frozen, the weight of her downfall now visible in the way her hands trembled slightly in her lap, the way her shoulders no longer squared themselves in defiance. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to beg, but nothing came out. And in that silence, something inside the boardroom shifted. The chair of the board cleared his throat, glanced around the table, and then nodded once. "We accept the terms." And just like that, the architecture of power realigned itself, not with fury, not with shouting, but with quiet inevitability. I turned to the console at the end of the table, input my credentials, and initiated the recovery sequence. In that moment, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt calm. They had forced me out thinking they could replace the foundation without disturbing the walls, but now they were learning the truth. The structure was never theirs. It was mine, and I hadn't left. I had just stepped outside to redesign the rules. The boardroom was no longer the same sterile chamber that once suffocated me with its polished silence and unspoken hierarchies. This time, it smelled different, less like anxiety masked by expensive cologne, and more like something restored, something reclaimed. The contract lay open in front of me, embossed in gold, a formal agreement listing Lock Systems LLC as the exclusive service provider for every layer of Sterling Financial's audit architecture. The number at the bottom, $2 million, shimmered like a line drawn in permanent ink across a decade of dismissal. The board chair slid a pen across the table toward me with a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Sign here," he said, no longer commanding, but careful. I picked it up without a word. There was no rush, no adrenaline, only a quiet rhythm in my hand as the ink began to flow. In that moment, everything I had been denied recognition, respect, agency condensed into a single stroke of black against white. The signatures I used to submit quietly on other people's proposals were now replaced by my own authority. I didn't just return, I rewrote the terms. As I closed the folder, a soft murmur of awkward clapping echoed across the room, hesitant and uneven. The CFO didn't meet my gaze. Camila, of course, wasn't there. She had already been escorted out of the building nearly an hour ago, through the same revolving doors I once passed, with loyalty in my chest and blind trust in my step. Now, it was her being followed by a wall of cameras, her being met with the chaos of flashbulbs and reporters, shouting questions she had no good answers for. Head down, hands shielding her face, she looked less like a leader and more like a figure retreating into the very shadow she tried to push me into. Her uncle trailed behind, his face hollow, his legacy crumbling in real time. I stood slowly, straightening my jacket, and as the leather folder snapped shut in my hand, no one stopped me. No one asked for final words or approval. The silence that greeted me wasn't forced or awkward. It was different now. It was heavy, with something I had never tasted in this room: respect. And not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind that comes when people realize you weren't just right, you were essential. At the door, I paused, just for a second, letting my gaze settle on the company's steel-etched logo across the far wall. For 11 years, that emblem had been a symbol I served under, a mark I carried with pride, even when they didn't see me. Now, it was just brushed metal, expensive and hollow, stripped of all meaning. I stepped closer and caught a faint reflection of myself in its polished surface. Not the woman they fired, not the name they tried to erase, but the architect of the system they couldn't survive without. And with a voice barely louder than a thought, I whispered something I'd been holding on to since the night she smiled and told me I had no future here. That future is now worth $2 billion, I said, not to gloat, not to wound, but to close the page completely. Because it wasn't about her anymore. It was about knowing that I had built something permanent, not for them, but for me. Outside, the city had changed too. The noise, the traffic, the lights, they were still chaotic, but now they felt like possibility, like motion I finally owned. My car pulled up to the curb, driver already waiting, door already open, and I stepped inside without hesitation. Minutes later, I arrived at my new office, 40 floors above the same city that once watched me fall. The glass walls stretched from end to end, reflecting a skyline that no longer intimidated me. And in the clean black surface of that window, I saw myself fully, without apology. I reached out, hand flat against the glass, and felt the pulse of the city beneath my fingertips, not as a dreamer or a follower, but as a builder. The storm they tried to trap me in wasn't behind me anymore. I had become the storm. And not the kind that destroys without reason, but the kind that clears the air, makes space, resets the landscape. I once thought silence was the safest way to survive. But now, I understood something much deeper. I didn't need a seat at their table. I could build one of my own, and I already had. From Mia Malkova's story, one powerful truth emerges. Real strength doesn't always come from loud resistance or dramatic confrontation, but from quiet preparation, unshakable principles, and the discipline to act with purpose when the moment is right. Mia didn't retaliate out of anger. She let the truth speak, protected by the very system she built when no one was watching. For many older adults, those who've endured betrayal, been overlooked, or quietly carried the weight of responsibility, this isn't just a story of justice. It's a reminder that you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to build something that lasts. When you invest in integrity, when you do your work deeply, and let it stand on its own, the right people will eventually see it. And more importantly, you'll see it in yourself. Life will challenge you. People may underestimate you, but quiet resilience, done with intention, will always outlast short-term power plays. This isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming dignity without ever losing it in the first place. Let your actions carry your voice, and let your legacy speak louder than your silence ever could.